It was almost midnight. The city lights outside the tall windows blinked like tiny stars. Inside the large office, everything was quiet. A few computers still hummed in the background, but most of the building was empty. Elon Musk sat alone at his desk, not typing, not talking, just staring at a glowing screen. His phone lay face down beside a cold cup of coffee. He hadn't touched either for a while. The room around him was sleek and modern, full of expensive furniture and tech gadgets, but none of it seemed to matter right now. The only sound was the ticking of a clock and the soft buzz of electricity in the walls. He had just signed one of the biggest business deals in history. Buying Twitter was something no one expected him to actually do, but he did it. People online were celebrating. Some were angry. Others were confused. But none of that noise could be heard in this quiet office. In here, it was just Elon and his thoughts. The day had been long, full of meetings, calls, camera flashes, and sharp questions from reporters. Everyone around him was excited, cheering, clapping, calling it a win. But Elon didn't feel like celebrating. Not tonight. He had smiled for the cameras, but now his face looked different, tired, serious, almost empty. He leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling. The soft lights above cast a gentle glow on the room. For a moment, he closed his eyes. His mind was full, not with ideas or plans, but with questions. Had he made the right choice? What would happen next? Was he ready for what was coming? A small light blinked on the edge of his desk, showing that a camera nearby had been left on. It wasn't meant to be recording anymore, but no one noticed. Elon didn't care. He wasn't thinking about cameras or interviews or what people would say tomorrow. He was thinking about the weight of everything. He had always been known for bold moves, rockets, cars, tunnels under cities. People called him fearless. But sitting alone in that room, he didn't feel fearless. He felt quiet. Not scared, just thoughtful, like a person who had climbed a tall mountain and finally looked down, realizing how far they had come and how far they still had to go. A deep breath left his lips slowly. He rubbed his face with both hands and sat still again, staring at the screen. On it, the Twitter logo floated like a symbol of both promise and pressure. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was personal. People would expect things from him now, and he wasn't sure how many of those things he could give. Outside, a soft breeze moved through the trees. Inside, Elon remained at his desk, quiet and still, as the city kept glowing far below. Earlier that evening, the boardroom had been full of excitement. Elon had entered the room with his usual confident stride, shaking hands with the team members and sharing a few words with investors. Everything had seemed like a big achievement. The deal to buy Twitter was finally complete. People congratulated him, pats on the back, smiles all around. Yet, when the clapping stopped and the room cleared, something changed. For Elon, the moment felt empty. The weight of the deal settled in as the noise faded away. He had just bought one of the world's largest social media platforms, and instead of feeling thrilled, he felt a heavy responsibility. He knew what came with this. Expectations, pressure. Everyone would be watching his next move. Back at his office, he sat at his desk, staring at his phone. The screen was filled with notifications, messages, and headlines about the deal. His eyes skimmed over the words, but his mind was far away. It was too much to process all at once. Twitter had always been a platform for quick thoughts, a place for news, jokes, and conversations. But now it was his responsibility. It wasn't just about managing a company. It was about handling millions of voices, opinions, and problems that came with such a platform. The first few hours after signing the deal felt like a blur. His assistant had tried to hand him a congratulatory note, but he had barely glanced at it. He couldn't focus on the small details. Instead, his thoughts kept drifting back to the same question. What had he just stepped into? The world seemed different in that moment. Social media, once a fun and exciting place to share ideas, now felt like a battleground. The very same people who had celebrated his success would now be waiting for him to fix everything they didn't like. Twitter was full of loud opinions, and loud opinions meant pressure. His mind wandered to all the problems Twitter had faced over the years. Misinformation, hate speech, privacy concerns. Fixing these issues would be no easy task, and yet here he was having to make it work. He'd always believed in taking on big challenges, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about building rockets or electric cars. This was about managing the flow of information that shaped people's daily lives. Elon glanced at the clock on his wall. It was late. Too late to think clearly. Yet there he was, sitting alone with only his thoughts. He remembered when he had first joined Twitter years ago, using it to share his ideas, his jokes, and his thoughts. It had been a simple, fun platform then. Now, everything had changed. The weight of it all was more than he had imagined. He leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh, feeling the quiet of the room wrap around him like a blanket. The excitement of the day was gone, replaced by the reality of what came next. He knew he couldn't just ignore the challenges. But tonight, all he could do was think about them in silence. The room felt colder now, the quiet stretching on like a heavy blanket. Elon had been sitting in the same position for what seemed like hours. The screen in front of him flickered with notifications, but he ignored them. He didn't want to look at the news or the endless comments. Instead, he found himself lost in thought, reflecting on how everything had changed so quickly. Earlier that day, he had walked out of the meeting room with a briefcase full of signed papers and a head full of new plans. The world had called it a victory. But now, in the silence of his office, it didn't feel like a victory at all. It felt like a mountain that had to be climbed, one step at a time. And the view from the top wasn't as clear as he had imagined. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through Twitter, the platform he had just taken control of. He had always been active on Twitter, tweeting his thoughts, sharing updates, and having casual conversations with people. But today, it was different. The platform felt like a massive responsibility, like something bigger than him. And the weight of it was starting to sink in. As he scrolled, he couldn't help but notice the comments. Some were excited, saying that this was the beginning of a new era. Others were critical, questioning his decisions and plans. People weren't afraid to share their opinions, and with millions of voices out there, the pressure to please everyone felt overwhelming. Elon stopped at one tweet in particular. It was from a random user asking, "What's next for Twitter? Will it be better or just another company trying to control us?" The words hit him harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on doing things differently, on taking risks that no one else dared to take. But now, with Twitter in his hands, he had to prove that he could make it better. Not just for the people who already believed in him, but for everyone who had doubts. He put the phone down, rubbed his eyes, and leaned back in his chair. His mind was racing. There was so much to think about, so much to plan. He had always been a visionary, seeing things before anyone else did. But this was a new level. The way information spread, the way people connected, the way ideas were shared. It was all changing, and he had to be at the center of it, guiding the ship through rough waters. Ellen sighed deeply, looking at the clock on the wall. It was well past midnight, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was too active, filled with questions and ideas. Could he really fix Twitter? Could he balance free speech with keeping the platform safe and respectful? There were no easy answers, just a lot of questions. He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the lights of the city below. The world was full of challenges, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about technology or money. It was about people, communication, and trust. And trust, he knew, was hard to build, and even harder to keep. The soft hum of the computers filled the room as Elon sat quietly, the glow of the screen the only light in the dark office. It had been a few days since the deal was finalized, and the world was still buzzing with questions and opinions. The weight of those expectations had not lightened, and the pressure only seemed to grow with each passing hour. But tonight, something unexpected happened. Elon had been lost in his thoughts, trying to make sense of everything, when he noticed the camera in the corner of the room. It was supposed to be off, but it had been recording. The camera had caught him in a moment of vulnerability, a moment no one was supposed to see. The footage wasn't meant for anyone's eyes. It wasn't part of a planned message or announcement. It was just Elon, sitting alone at his desk, tired and unsure of what the future held. The camera had captured the way his hand rested on his forehead, the way he seemed to sigh deeply, as though the weight of everything was finally taking its toll. The footage wasn't a dramatic moment, not something to be used for a news story or a headline. It was simply a quiet, honest look at the man behind the headlines. And yet, someone had found it. By morning, the footage had somehow made its way into the public eye. It was shared, commented on, and discussed. Some people laughed, making jokes about the world's richest man being vulnerable. Others saw it differently. Somehow, they saw it as a human moment, a reminder that even the most successful people could struggle in silence. Elon didn't know how the footage got out, but he wasn't angry. He had always believed in being open, in showing the real side of things, even when it was hard. The public wasn't used to seeing that side of him. They were used to the confident businessman, the visionary who always seemed to have everything figured out. But the footage, whether intentional or not, showed a different side of him. He watched as the world reacted to it. It was strange, knowing that people now had a glimpse into his private thoughts. But it didn't feel wrong. Maybe, just maybe, this was a reminder to everyone, not just to him, that no one is perfect. No one has all the answers. Everyone has moments of doubt. As he sat at his desk, watching the comments scroll by, Elon realized something important. He couldn't control how people saw him. He couldn't control how they would react to the next big decision, or the next tweet he sent, but he could be himself. He could keep going, facing the challenges ahead with the same determination that had gotten him this far. And so he decided to move on. The footage was out there, but he couldn't dwell on it. There were bigger things to think about. The future of Twitter, the future of technology. It was all waiting for him. And as always, he had to keep moving forward. The days after the footage went viral were filled with noise. Some people praised Elon for showing his human side, while others mocked him for the vulnerability he had accidentally shared. Yet, through it all, one thing remained clear. He couldn't escape the expectations that surrounded him. Back in his office, Elon had barely had time to think about the fallout. His phone buzzed constantly, filled with messages from team members, investors, and even friends, all asking how he was doing. But he didn't have time for small talk. The responsibility of owning Twitter now weighed heavily on him, and he knew there was no turning back. As he sat at his desk, a single message caught his eye. It was from one of his closest advisors. Elon, we need to focus. The platform is under pressure from all sides. You need to show your plan. What are we doing next? He stared at the message for a long time. There was no easy answer. People expected him to have the solution to Twitter's problems: misinformation, harassment, privacy issues. All of these challenges had piled up over the years, and now they were his to solve. But where should he start? What did he even want Twitter to be in the future? Elon wasn't used to feeling this uncertain. In his past ventures, he had always had a clear vision: build rockets to reach space, create electric cars to change the future of transportation. But Twitter, it was different. It wasn't just a product. It was a place where millions of people shared their thoughts every day, and he had to figure out how to keep it from becoming a platform that only fueled division. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The lights of the city stretched out in every direction, but everything felt distant. How could he fix something so vast? The answer wasn't simple, but it had to start somewhere. He needed a plan, a vision that would bring people together, even if just for a moment of shared experience. He thought about the time when he first joined Twitter. It had been fun, an easy way to connect with others, share quick thoughts, and even make jokes. But somewhere along the way, it had become more than that. Now it was a battleground for opinions, and he wasn't sure how to make it a space where everyone felt heard. Elon returned to his desk and pulled up a blank document. He needed a new strategy, something that would both fix the problems and rebuild trust. But he had no idea where to start. He only knew that he couldn't ignore it. The weight of Twitter was now on his shoulders, and the world was watching. For the first time in a long time, Elon didn't have all the answers. But one thing was clear: he couldn't give up now. There was too much at stake. He had to face the challenge head-on, whether or not he was ready. The days were starting to blend together. Each one felt like a repeat of the last. Endless meetings, constant phone calls, and the pressure of living up to expectations. But one morning, something unexpected happened. As Elon sat at his desk, reviewing plans for Twitter's future, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from his teenage son. Elon had always kept his family life separate from his work, but when he saw the message, he smiled. It was short and simple. "Don't let them get to you, Dad. I'm proud of you." Elon stared at the screen for a moment, the words sinking in. It was strange, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a while: peace. His son didn't care about the headlines or the pressure. He didn't care about how the world saw Elon. He just saw his father doing his best, and that was enough for him. Elon set the phone down and took a deep breath. Maybe he had been looking at everything the wrong way. The weight of managing Twitter was huge, but he didn't have to carry it alone. There were people who believed in him, people who saw his efforts, his struggles, and his intentions. That reminder, simple as it was, gave him the strength to keep moving forward. As the day went on, Elon began to refocus. He spent hours working with his team, discussing possible ways to improve Twitter's platform. He wasn't just thinking about profits or what would make him look good in the eyes of the media. He thought about the real issues: online hate, misinformation, and the responsibility he had to make the platform a better space for everyone. The more he thought about it, the clearer his vision became. Twitter didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be real. People needed to be able to express themselves without fear of being silenced or attacked. But at the same time, it had to be a space where respect and kindness could grow. Elon knew that finding a balance would be tough, but it was the only way forward. That evening, he sent a message to his team. We need to rebuild trust. We need to show people that we can do better. Let's focus on safety, transparency, and creating a space where voices can be heard, but where harmful behavior won't be tolerated. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start, and that was all he needed right now. Sometimes the answers weren't obvious. Sometimes it took time to figure things out. But one thing was certain, Elon Musk wasn't going to give up. He had a vision, and he was determined to make it work, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The message from his son stayed with him. Sometimes all a person needed was someone who believed in them. For Elon, that reminder was enough to take the next step, and the next, until the future of Twitter began to look a little clearer. The following weeks passed by quickly, filled with nonstop work. Elon was no longer just managing the company. He was steering it through a storm. As more and more people turned to Twitter to share their opinions on his leadership, the challenges seemed to grow with each passing day. Every decision felt like it was under a microscope, every move scrutinized. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Elon began to embrace the weight of his role. He started making changes at a faster pace. His team was busy creating new policies aimed at reducing hate speech, misinformation, and harassment on the platform. It wasn't easy. There were countless arguments, discussions, and debates over what would work best, but slowly he could see the progress. One of the first changes he pushed for was stricter guidelines about online bullying. It was a sensitive topic, and many people had differing opinions on how to handle it. But Elon knew it was something that needed attention. He wanted Twitter to be a space where people could express themselves freely, but without hurting others in the process. The new rules weren't perfect, but they were a step in the right direction. As Elon sat at his desk one afternoon, reviewing the feedback from the changes, he thought about how far Twitter had come. The platform still had its problems, but there was a noticeable shift. Users were starting to feel safer. The atmosphere on the site was less toxic. And even though there were still plenty of issues, it felt like they were finally moving towards something better. Elon looked back at the footage that had leaked that night, his quiet, unsure moment. He thought about how that moment had exposed a side of him that he rarely showed the world. But now, as he looked at the progress they had made, he realized that the vulnerability wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was human. It was a reminder that no one had all the answers, but that didn't mean they couldn't try to make things better. The new policies were working, but Elon knew the road ahead was still long. There would be setbacks, criticism, and moments where things didn't go as planned. But he had learned something important through this process. Failure didn't mean the end. It was just part of the journey. It was through mistakes and challenges that he could learn and grow. He spent the next few months listening more, taking feedback from users, employees, and even critics. Twitter wasn't just a tool for communication. It was a place where people felt connected, heard, and understood. And that was something he wanted to protect. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Elon walked to the window in his office and looked out at the city below. The lights of the building stretched far into the distance, each one a symbol of the countless people relying on his decisions. But this time, it didn't feel as heavy. He had learned that while he couldn't make everyone happy, he could keep working towards something better, something real. Months had passed, and Twitter was slowly changing. The platform was still a place for voices to clash and opinions to be shared, but it felt different. There was a new sense of balance. The hate speech had decreased. The misinformation was being addressed more efficiently, and users were beginning to notice. It wasn't perfect, but progress had been made. Elon had learned so much over these months. Running Twitter wasn't like running his other companies. He couldn't just focus on technology or products. He had to consider the people, the millions of individuals who use the platform every day to share their thoughts, their ideas, and sometimes their frustrations. He had received a lot of criticism in the beginning, some saying he was too focused on changing things too quickly, while others argued that he wasn't doing enough. But as the months went on, he began to understand the value of patience. Change was slow, especially when it involved millions of people's lives. And not everyone would agree with every decision. But as long as they were making improvements, that was what mattered. One day, Elon sat in a meeting with his team, discussing the next big update to the platform. They were talking about creating better tools for users to control their online experiences. Users wanted more control over their feeds, more transparency about how content was shown to them. It was a challenge, but Elon was ready for it. This was what he had signed up for, to create something better for everyone. As the meeting continued, Elon couldn't help but think back to that moment, the one when the footage of him had leaked. He had been sitting in his office, exhausted and unsure, and that moment had opened his eyes. It had reminded him that even the most successful people have their doubts, their struggles. It was a reminder that no one could do everything alone, and it was okay to admit that. Since then, he had learned to take things one step at a time. He didn't have all the answers, but he was willing to find them. And he wasn't afraid of failing, either. Mistakes were part of the process. Each one was a lesson that helped guide him in the right direction. Outside the office window, the city stretched out beneath the fading light of day. The buildings seemed to glow in the distance, each one representing the countless people who had put their trust in him to make things better. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't going to pretend that he was, but he was trying, and that effort, he knew, was what mattered most. Helen stood up and looked around the room at his team. They were all working hard, trying to figure out what came next for Twitter. He didn't have all the answers, but he was no longer carrying the weight of it alone. Together, they were building something that had the potential to change the way people communicated. It wasn't just about being in charge. It was about making a difference, one step at a time.